Matt Ridley. How are you doing?
Hello, how are you?
Hey, how's it going? So, you're a best-selling author, and you're a journalist, and you're a former member of the UK's House of Lords. Uh,
Correct, yes.
you've written for The Economist, for The
hmm
Times, and The
hmm
Wall Street Journal, right?
Yes, yeah.
And your books have sold over 1 million copies.
Yes, it may be even almost 2 million now, but yeah.
Wow. Wow. I mean, you're a great writer. uh,
Thank you very
so,
much.
so I came across you through the Rational Optimist, which
Yes,
was written about 14 years ago now,
correct. 2010 it came out.
2010. So you went from writing the Rational Optimist, and then in 2020 we faced COVID, and then
hmm
people were not very optimistic after that. Um, so tell me a little bit about the rational optimist. And I know, so from the rational optimist, you're very optimistic in a time where people are very pessimistic. What do you think that is? What do you think that people are so pessimistic as opposed to your view?
Yes. Well, I think people have been very pessimistic for a very long time. I quote a lot of people in the 1970s who were saying that the future was bleak for mankind. The population explosion was unstoppable, famine was inevitable, pollution was going to shorten human lifespan, cancer was on the increase, the deserts were advancing, the etc., etc. Apocalyptic things were being said, particularly in the 1970s. And I choose the 1970s because I was young then and I believed them.
Hmm.
And I thought the future was terrible. And I thought I would have a short life and a miserable life and probably get very hungry because I
Yeah.
read too much. And they were wrong. They were absolutely 180 degrees wrong. My lifetime, I was born in 1958,
Hmm.
I'm 66 years old, has seen the greatest destruction of poverty, the greatest raising of living standards, the greatest increase in lifespan, the greatest reduction in child mortality globally that anybody's lifespan has ever seen. Nobody has ever lived through a transformation in human living standards as spectacular as my generation has.
Right.
And it continues today, despite the pandemic, which was a setback for the world, but partly a self inflicted one. It was the lockdowns that did a huge amount of harm, as well as the pandemic itself. Despite that, poverty continues to retreat, living standards continue to rise, the world is getting wealthier, healthier, cleverer, kinder, more peaceful, more equal, freer, cleaner, more equal. People don't believe that. Happier. People don't believe that. But the evidence is there. Now, we have a tendency to not notice what is happening elsewhere in the world. And in the last 14 years since the Rational Optimist came out, many people have said to me, you cannot still be a rational optimist. Look at what's happening with the Eurozone. Look at what's happening in Crimea. Look at what's happening with Ebola. Look at what's happening in Syria. Bad things still happen. Of course they do. But this has also seen African living standards rise much faster than anybody expected this period. Mortality from malaria and HIV, two great big infectious diseases that are killing many people in Africa, to go down very sharply in the last 14 years. This has been a very good time to be alive for Africans and for Asians. Europeans have seen stagnant economics. Americans have seen less improvements in their lives than they were seeing before. But it is simply not true to say that there are reasons to be pessimistic about human beings generally at the moment. Um, I'm fond of quoting Thomas Macaulay, who wrote in 1830, why is it that with nothing but improvement behind us, we are to expect nothing but deterioration before us? And he wrote that at a time when there had been very little improvement in human living standards. So I still think that because of innovation, human beings are improving their lives on the whole, on average, despite exceptions. And I think that will continue.
Do you think the media actually has a lot of influence on why people are so pessimistic and they think that the world is just becoming terrible?
Yes, the media undoubtedly focuses on bad news. This is partly because good news is gradual, whereas bad news is sudden. You know, the improvement in living standards is not something you can make a headline out of, because there isn't a sort of moment when it happens. But a plane crash is a sudden event. It's partly because the media is playing into our own instincts. We do tend to want to read about bad news more than we want to read about good news. This has been demonstrated in all sorts of ways. And that's probably sensible on our part. We need to warn ourselves of the risks and dangers in the world. But it's not just the media. I think there's a very interesting phenomenon, which is that people are much more optimistic about their own lives than they should be. But they're much more pessimistic about the planet than they should be. And there's a gradation in between. So the more local the entity you're looking at, the more optimistic people are. The more global the entity, the more pessimistic. So people are optimistic about themselves. They're fairly optimistic about their town. They're not very optimistic about their country, and they're not at all optimistic about the world. So that suggests that where we know enough, we can override the pessimism bias. But where we know less, because we don't really understand the whole world, we are prey to people trying to alarm us, trying to exploit our tendency to read bad news. And, a lot of environmental organizations, a lot of pressure groups exist solely to seek out bad news and deliver it to us with the hope that it will cause us to donate money to them or support them or give them clicks or whatever.
Yeah. Because is this why people think higher of themselves than they actually are, but remain fairly pessimistic about the world?
Yeah, I mean, people think they're going to stay married longer than they do. They think they're better drivers than they are. There's all sorts of ways in which we're just a little bit too optimistic about ourselves.
Yeah, with the current election coming up, they tend to play a lot on this, that the world is worse off than it actually is. And both parties play into this. So it's possibly the reason that they know what will get clicks. They know what will get people activated to go out and vote for them. So you also have this interesting anecdote that no one knows how to build a mouse. No one in the world knows how to build a mouse. And you go into saying there's certainly some companies that they know how to run the company, like the owner of the company, they definitely know how to run the company, but no one necessarily knows how to build the mouse. You have the oil wells that produce the plastic to make that produce the plastic. You have the coffee bean growers that fuel those.
Yeah, so let me I was deliberately borrowing from a very famous essay, which I think is an incredibly important piece of writing, which everybody should read. It's a very short essay. It's called I, Pencil, and it was written by a man named Leonard Read in 1958. And the conceit of the essay is that the pencil is writing the essay. The pencil is exploring how it came into the world. And this pencil does a lot of research, and it discovers that it's made of wood and graphite and a little bit of metal and a little bit of an eraser at the top. And it explores how the wood got there and how the graphite got there. And it found that the graphite was mined in Sri Lanka, and it finds that the wood was cut down in a forest in Oregon. And it finds that the man who cut down the tree was drinking coffee, and the coffee that he drank was being grown in Brazil, and so on and so on. And so the conclusion is that millions of people contributed to the making of one very simple object, a pencil. But not one of these millions of people knows how to make a pencil, because the man running the company that makes the pencils doesn't know how to cut down a tree or to mine graphite. And this was brought home very nicely in recent years by a couple of artists, actually, who tried to make, one of them tried to make a suit from scratch, and another tried to make a toaster from scratch. You know, he would go and find iron ore, and he would refine it into iron and so on. And it, of course, was incredibly difficult to do from scratch. And so for me, the take-home message here is that all of the technologies and all of the devices that we make the world work with are the knowledge of how to make them.
That was a short conversation with Matt Ridley. I faced some technical difficulties during our call, and it made it hard for it to move forward. I hope you enjoyed our brief conversation, and until next time, have a great one.